What minor materials they use? Well, I have a list in here, as my memory is not perfect. Plants, like humans, require things like vitamins. For example, we require trace amounts of cobalt for vitamin B12. It's not something we think of in our diet, but we have to have it there. And plants are the same. They also require cobalt. Other micronutrients that they need are boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and iron. It's interesting to think about iron to start with. You don't really think about there being iron in plants, and there aren't any obvious iron compounds. But funnily enough, they need it to synthesize chlorophyll. And so if you don't give them a trace amount of iron in their diet, they go yellow and they die, which is unfortunate for the plants anyway. So another one, of course, that they need is magnesium. Magnesium is the ion in the middle of the chlorophyll molecule that vibrates and absorbs the light energy and makes chlorophyll look green. So without magnesium, they wouldn't be able to photosynthesize as much. There are substitutes. There are some chlorophylls that don't require magnesium, but it remains the most common sort of trace element that they require. One thing about iron, of course, is that it's a very common element, and you would wonder why a plant would ever have any trouble getting it. But because they absorb everything through their roots, and it interferes with their uptake through the roots, stops them getting iron. So, for example, if they grow on limestone and the pH is too high, then the iron comes in forms that are insoluble, and the plant can't take them up. Iron is also a very limiting nutrient in the oceans. If you look out into the oceans, there's almost no iron in solution at all, and that limits the growth of the phytoplankton, the small floating plants in the middle of the ocean. And in fact, there have been many experiments with seeding the ocean with soluble forms of iron to encourage phytoplankton blooms, if nothing else as a means possibly of taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you can see that reflected, that necessity for iron, when you look at the relationship between falls of dust from the land and the way that phytoplankton grows. There are another one that they require in some amount is phosphorus. Phosphorus is the common, what would you call it, the battery of life in organisms. Almost every energy process requires phosphorus in it. So of course we know particularly about ATP, which our body burns all the time, decomposes it to ADP and phosphate. And that gives off the energy that drives our muscles, that makes our brain work and everything else. And it's the same for plants. They also use ATP to drive their photosynthetic processes. The photosynthesis is actually divided into two parts. There's the light part and the dark part. The light part is all about capturing sunlight and turning it into storable forms of energy that the plant can then use for other things. So it creates ATP, and it also creates a compound called NADPH, which it uses later on as a proton source. And those things drive the second part of photosynthesis, which are the dark processes, which are the ones that most of us learn about in painful chemical cycles like the Calvin-Basham-Benson cycle, also known as the C3 cycle. It's called the C3 cycle because the first things that it produces are 3 carbon compounds. But the whole process is driven by the ATP and the NADPH that was created in the light part of photosynthesis. So they also require, if you look at the Calvin cycle, you will see there are a number of phosphorylated compounds that actually occur within the cycle. For example, during the synthesis of glucose, it passes through fructose 6-phosphate to glucose 6-phosphate, and then finally to glucose. So it's a vital part of the chemistry as well as of the energy processes that drive the cycle round. Another material that is rather difficult for plants and is essential to them is nitrogen. Nitrogen, of course, is present in almost all proteins, amino acids, and a lot of enzymes and so on as well. Now, the problem for plants is they're surrounded by nitrogen. Roughly 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but they can't use it. It's only a very limited set of plants, mostly the legumes, that use bacteria in their roots to actually grab atmospheric nitrogen. Most plants rely on ammonia or nitrate that they get mostly from the soil. What do they do with it? Well, of course, rubisco, which is the commonest enzyme in the world, which captures the CO2 at the beginning of the process of photosynthesis, is their major sink for nitrogen. So typically, if you look at the living parts of a plant, say the leaves, they may contain about, let's say, 5% of nitrogen. It varies a good bit. Some plants, particularly C4 plants, often have less nitrogen than the C3 plants, like, for example, sunflower. Other parts of the plant, the wood, for example, have almost no nitrogen in them. So if you cut down an eucalyptus and you take a sample of the wood from the center of the trunk, you will find almost literally no nitrogen. They have captured the nitrogen that was originally in there when the wood was made, and they've moved it to places where it's actually going to be useful to them. Another very common compound in plant that uses nitrogen is carbonic anhydrase, and that's an enzyme that no one ever thinks about and probably doesn't deserve a lot of thought. However, it seems to be important to the plants, and what it does is it converts between bicarbonate, bicarbonate particularly, and carbon dioxide. And that helps the plant to make carbon dioxide available at the sites where it's going to be bound by rubisco, and helps, because of the high possible concentrations of bicarbonate, helps to move the CO2 from the outside of the cell where it's taken up from inside the leaf and across to the sites where it's going to be photosynthesized.